Keanu Reeves sat comfortably in his first-class seat, adjusting the small, simple pendant necklace around his neck. The flight had just begun, and passengers were still settling in, finding their seats and getting comfortable. As Keanu looked out the window, a flight attendant walked down the aisle, offering a warm greeting to the passengers. When her eyes landed on Keanu's necklace, her smile faltered for a moment. She stopped in front of him, staring at the pendant with a clear disapproval in her eyes. Keanu noticed her gaze, wondering if something was wrong. The flight attendant stood in front of Keanu, her smile still on her face, but there was something off about her expression. She cleared her throat before speaking. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice polite but firm. "Some passengers might find religious symbols uncomfortable." She glanced at Keanu's necklace again, her tone becoming a bit more pointed. "I would appreciate it if you could remove it, just to keep the atmosphere welcoming for everyone." Keanu was taken aback. He stared at her for a moment, unsure if he had heard correctly. He had worn that necklace for years, and it was something very personal to him. The pendant was small, simple, and meant no harm to anyone. "Sorry, I didn't quite understand," Keanu said, his voice calm but confused. "Are you saying my necklace is causing discomfort?" The attendant didn't respond right away. She just kept looking at the necklace, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then, after a pause, she spoke again. "It's just that some passengers may feel uncomfortable with it," she repeated, her tone a little more insistent now. "We try to avoid displays that might cause any issues." Keanu felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been traveling for years and had never been asked to remove something so personal. He thought for a moment, wondering if it was some kind of misunderstanding. "It's just a necklace," he said, his voice still calm but now with a hint of frustration. "It's not meant to offend anyone." The attendant, however, didn't seem to back down. She stood there, waiting for Keanu to comply, as though her request was final. Keanu glanced around the cabin, noticing that a few passengers were starting to look up, watching the exchange between him and the flight attendant. Some of them were glancing at their phones, possibly recording the scene, but the attendant didn't seem to notice or care. Keanu shook his head slightly. "I'm not going to remove it," he said, his voice steady. "I don't see how this is a problem." The attendant's eyes tightened, and she repeated her request once more, making it clear that she wasn't going to let this go easily. The tension in the air grew thick, and Keanu could feel it. Keanu sat back in his seat, trying to remain calm. He looked at the flight attendant, confused and a little frustrated. "I don't understand," he said, his voice even. "Why should my necklace, something that's part of my personal faith, cause discomfort to anyone? It's just a symbol of who I am, not something meant to upset anyone." The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, clearly trying to find the right words. I just think it could make some passengers feel uneasy," she said, her voice faltering slightly. But it wasn't the answer Keanu was looking for. He frowned, leaning forward slightly. "Is there a rule against wearing religious jewelry on the plane?" Keanu asked, his tone now more direct. "Is this against the policy of the airline?" The attendant shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unable to give a clear answer. Keanu could see that she wasn't ready to provide a solid explanation. The uncertainty in her eyes made it clear to him that she wasn't speaking on behalf of the airline's official rules, but rather her own personal views. Keanu's suspicions grew. He had been flying for years, and never once had he been told that his religious symbol might cause problems. He wasn't going to back down now, especially not in a situation like this. "Look," Keanu said, his voice still calm but firm, "I'm not asking for permission. I'm just asking for respect. This necklace represents my beliefs, and that's something very personal to me. It's not meant to make anyone uncomfortable." But my beliefs should be respected, especially in a public space like first class. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. I shouldn't have to explain myself, especially for something so basic. I've never been asked to remove it before, and I don't see why I should now. The flight attendant didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked away for a moment, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Keanu could feel the tension rising around them, but he stood his ground. He wasn't going to let anyone make him feel uncomfortable for expressing his beliefs. As the conversation between Keanu and the flight attendant continued, a few passengers nearby began to notice the rising tension. They exchanged curious glances, whispering quietly amongst themselves. One passenger, sitting a few rows behind, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in front of him. The soft buzz of hushed voices spread through the cabin, and before long, a phone camera was pointed toward Keanu and the flight attendant, silently recording the exchange. The atmosphere was growing increasingly uncomfortable, not just for Keanu, but for everyone around them. The flight attendant seemed to be getting more agitated, her composure slipping as the passengers watched closely. Then, from the back of the cabin, a voice called out, cutting through the tension. "You wouldn't do this to someone wearing a Star of David or a hijab," the passenger said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. The words hung in the air, and the cabin fell silent for a moment. Other passengers looked up, some nodding in agreement, others glancing nervously at the flight attendants. Slowly, more people began to join in, adding their voices to the growing chorus of disapproval. "Yeah, why is a cross necklace any different?" another passenger chimed in, their voice sharp. "This is ridiculous." Soon, murmurs of agreement spread throughout the cabin, like a wave, growing louder with each passing second. Some passengers shook their heads, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Others were pulling out their phones, snapping pictures or taking videos of the confrontation. It seemed like everyone was getting involved, whether they wanted to or not. Keanu watched as the crowd began to rally behind him, their voices rising in support. The flight attendant, clearly caught off guard by the reaction, faltered. She looked around at the passengers, unsure how to respond. The situation was quickly spiraling out of her control, and it was becoming clear that the more she pushed, the more she was losing the support of those around her. Keanu stayed calm, his posture firm. He wasn't the one causing the scene, it was the flight attendant who had made this personal. And now, the passengers were speaking up, calling out what they saw as an unfair and discriminatory act. Keanu didn't have to say much. The people around him were already making his point for him. As the tension in the cabin continued to build, the first flight attendant seemed to lose control of the situation. Just then, a second flight attendant walked over, wearing the stripes of a supervisor. She moved quickly through the cabin, her eyes scanning the scene, taking in the uncomfortable atmosphere. The supervisor stood for a moment, observing the exchange, before turning to the first attendant. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm, as though expecting a clear explanation. The first attendant, looking flustered, quickly tried to explain her actions. "I just thought the necklace might make some passengers uncomfortable. We like to keep the atmosphere neutral on the plane," she said, her voice wavering as she spoke. It was clear she was struggling to stand by her decision. The supervisor listened but didn't seem convinced. She turned her gaze to Keanu, who was sitting quietly, still maintaining his calm demeanor. After a few moments, the supervisor addressed him directly. "You're free to wear your necklace, Mr. Reeves," she said, her tone polite but firm, making it clear that there was no issue with his choice of jewelry. The first attendant's face immediately drained of color. She stood there for a moment, her mouth slightly open, clearly surprised by the supervisor's words. The weight of the situation seemed to hit her all at once. She had expected the supervisor to back her up, but instead, she had been overruled. As the supervisor walked away, leaving the first attendant to process the situation, Keanu could see the change in the flight attendant's body language. Her posture stiffened, and she seemed to retreat inward, her frustration visible. She glanced nervously around at the passengers, who were still murmuring amongst themselves. It was clear she had misjudged the situation badly. The first attendant's frustration was now evident. She knew she had made a mistake, and it was too late to undo it. Her earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a sense of regret. She kept glancing at Keanu, who remained composed, watching her every move. The entire cabin was watching now, and the flight attendant knew that she had lost this battle. As the argument dragged on, the tension in the cabin was palpable. More passengers began to openly criticize the first flight attendant, voicing their disbelief at how she was treating Keanu. One person spoke up, saying, "This is ridiculous. You can't just pick on someone for wearing a necklace. What's next?" Others nodded in agreement, adding their own comments about the situation being unfair. It was clear the first attendant's actions were drawing unwanted attention from everyone around. The passengers who had been quietly watching the scene now felt emboldened to speak out. Some began taking photos, while others recorded the confrontation on their phones. The flight attendants could no longer pretend the situation wasn't escalating. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as more people started to question why a simple necklace was causing such a fuss. A few passengers even pointed out that they had seen people wearing other religious symbols without any problem. The flight crew seemed cornered, with no clear way to defuse the situation. The first attendant looked increasingly uncomfortable as more eyes turned to her, and Keanu remained calm, letting the passengers voice their opinions. The flight attendant could feel the weight of their stares and knew that her actions were being judged by everyone. She tried to hold her ground, but it was clear she was losing control of the situation. Realizing that things were getting out of hand, the first attendant began to retreat, moving back toward the aisle. Her face was flushed, and she avoided eye contact with the passengers who had been speaking up. It was too late for her to backtrack now, and she knew it. The damage had been done, and the tension in the cabin wasn't going to fade easily. Keanu, on the other hand, remained composed. He didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He simply stood his ground, asserting his right to wear the necklace and be treated with respect. He had made his point, and now the passengers were doing the talking for him. The first attendant's attempts to police something as personal as Keanu's faith had backfired, and she was left to face the growing public backlash. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Keanu leaned back in his seat, trying to relax after the tense confrontation. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a flurry of notifications lighting up the screen. It didn't take long for him to realize that the situation on the plane had already gone viral. A video of the entire exchange had been shared widely across social media, and it was spreading fast. The video, only a minute long, was captioned, "Keanu Reeves harassed over his faith in first class, you won't believe what happens next." Keanu could hardly believe it. What had started as a personal exchange between him and the flight attendant had quickly turned into a viral moment. He watched as comments and reactions flooded in. The video had already sparked a huge conversation online. Many users were expressing their support for Keanu, praising him for standing up for his beliefs. "Keanu is a class act," one comment read. "This is what happens when we let people push us around for simply being ourselves." Another person added, "It's a necklace, not a problem. Good for Keanu for not backing down." As the comments kept coming, more and more people joined the discussion, some sharing their own experiences of having their faith or beliefs challenged. It became clear that the video was touching a nerve with people everywhere. It wasn't just about Keanu's necklace anymore. It had become a symbol of standing up for one's right to express personal beliefs without fear of judgment or discrimination. The video also sparked debates on social media about respect for different religions and cultures. People were questioning why certain symbols seemed to provoke more discomfort than others, and many were asking why the flight attendant had singled out Keanu in the first place. Keanu scrolled through the comments, feeling a mix of gratitude and disbelief. He had known that the situation was uncomfortable, but he hadn't expected it to go this far. The support was overwhelming, and it seemed that the more people learned about what had happened, the more they were rallying behind him. As the video continued to spread, it became clear that the conversation wasn't going to end when the flight did. Keanu had become a symbol of standing firm in the face of injustice, and the incident had sparked a movement online, showing the world just how far a simple act of standing up for one's faith could go. As the situation continued to unfold, the supervisor returned to Keanu's seat, trying to restore some sense of calm. With a forced smile, she offered him a drink. "Mr. Reeves, I apologize for the misunderstanding," she said. "We'd like to offer you a drink on the house, to make up for the inconvenience." Keanu glanced at her, the tension still thick in the air. He appreciated the gesture but knew that it didn't change what had just happened. He gave a polite smile, accepting the drink, but he wasn't going to let the situation slide. "Thank you," he said calmly, "but it's not about the drink. It's about respect." The supervisor nodded, understanding that Keanu wasn't looking for a quick fix. She had hoped the gesture would smooth things over, but she knew now that the damage had already been done. The entire cabin had witnessed the incident, and there was no way to erase the impact it had caused. The first attendant, now visibly shaken, stood a few feet away, looking down at the floor. She avoided making eye contact with Keanu, clearly embarrassed by the situation. Her earlier confidence was completely gone. She seemed lost, trying to regain her composure but failing to do so. The passengers around them continued to murmur quietly, some still shaking their heads, others looking between Keanu and the attendant. Keanu, however, remained calm and firm. He didn't let the awkwardness of the situation affect him. He had made his point clear, and now it was up to the airline to handle the fallout. He glanced around the cabin, where passengers were still talking quietly among themselves, but none were speaking in favor of the first attendant's actions. The atmosphere in first class remained tense for the rest of the flight. The incident had left a mark, and no amount of damage control could change that. The flight attendants kept their distance from Keanu, the first attendant still visibly uncomfortable, while the supervisor moved about the cabin, trying to restore order, but the air felt thick with unease. Keanu settled back into his seat, his thoughts still on the situation. He had stood his ground, and now it was clear that the first attendant's attempt to control him had backfired. The damage was done, and no apology or drink would undo the events that had just unfolded. As the plane began its descent and landed at the airport, Keanu could feel the weight of the moment. As he stood up to leave, several passengers around him nodded in respect. Some even whispered words of encouragement, expressing their support for how he had handled the situation. A few people came up to him as he walked down the aisle, thanking him for standing up for his beliefs. It was clear that the passengers who had witnessed the event were now on his side. The story quickly continued to spread across social media, with people from all over commenting and sharing their thoughts. The video of the incident went viral, and the first attendant's actions became a cautionary tale. People were talking about the importance of respecting others' beliefs, especially in public spaces. The story wasn't just about Keanu anymore, it had become about standing up for personal rights and faith. As Keanu left the plane, he knew that his quiet act of resistance had made an impact far beyond the flight. The support he had received from the passengers, and the viral attention the incident had gotten, showed him that he wasn't alone in his beliefs. He had made a stand, and it had resonated with many. The story was a reminder that everyone deserves respect, no matter where they are or what they believe. As the final thought, Keanu couldn't help but ask, should faith be treated with respect no matter where you are?